Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this week's discussion and update on COVID-19 webinar. My name is Kathy Purdy. I'm a marketing manager at Schoeneck King. Two quick housekeeping items before we get started. Please enter your questions through the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen, and we will do the best we can to address those throughout today's presentation. Also, your comments and suggestions for future topics are important to our attorneys, so we would appreciate you taking a moment to complete the brief survey once today's webinar has completed. So to get things started, I'm going to hand it over to Pete Jones.
Thank you, Kathy, and good afternoon, everyone. Can't believe it's December already. The calendar certainly is moving along. I guess it does every year, but it seems like moving pretty quickly at this point. I want to get started today with Katie Anderson. Katie's going to talk about sort of the continuous updates from Albany. Everything just keeps evolving, morphing, and so we got to keep our finger on what's going on there. Katie, please let us know what's happening.
Yeah, no problem. You know, I saw a pretty funny tweet the other day that was the saying's time flies when we're having fun, but time seems to be flying faster when we're not having fun. So here we are with some updates from Albany. Yesterday, there were some big changes that were announced with the cluster strategy and with fighting COVID-19 in New York State. The first thing to look at here is that, this is a big warning flag, and I'll go into details about that in a little bit. The 5 pillars of what this means is, first, we're going to be looking at hospital capacity. Hospital capacity will, those metrics are going to be going into cluster zones. And I'll talk about that in a little bit, but we don't know yet what those metrics are. We just know that when designating cluster zones, hospital capacity will be something that will factor in a very important way. Second thing, we're looking at increasing testing resources and then also balancing testing resources and availability. Part of that feeds into the third pillar of fighting COVID for winter 2021. It's keeping schools open. The state emphasis is now on keeping K through 8 schools open to the extent that they can safely be open. As we know at this point, transmission rates in schools are low, and which has been a pleasant surprise in all of this. One of the things that they're looking at for schools is, and this guidance has yet to come out, but for schools, they're looking at pooled testing, and they're also looking at orange zone. The testing would be 20% of the student and staff and teacher body over a month. And additionally, in the red zone, it would be 30% over a month. Both of those are supposedly on a rolling basis. Again, when we have more information about that, we will get that out to you. Looking at the biggest thing here, and this is the big one, number 4, small gatherings. Small gatherings now account for 65% of COVID cases in New York. That is a remarkable change from where we were in March, where we were, focusing on bars, restaurants, and then even over the summer when we were still focusing on bars and restaurants. It's now turned into living room spread. The state is going to be going through a large public relations campaign to basically discourage people from unsafely gathering in each other's homes, especially during the holiday season. Finally, looking at the vaccination program and getting that up to snuff, to have that distributed around the state. The CDC is putting out guidance today, or they're voting on today, they're basically the order of people who will be eligible for the vaccine first. So we'll have more of that information today. One other thing to look at as well, we're looking at these changes in the cluster metrics. And the cluster metrics are now going to include regional hospital bed capacity, ICU capacity, staffing ratios, and daily hospital admissions. We don't know the numbers yet on what that will be. They are waiting for the Thanksgiving bump to come through. Supposedly, we'll see those numbers this week. I imagine that they will be towards the end of the week, but at least the work week. But who knows? It could come tomorrow. And looking at these things, this is a big warning flag that's going up. We're having an emergency break that's going in. That basically, if a region hits certain metrics, we go to New York on pause, which is interesting. I think that will mean, while red zone guidance has been very similar to what New York on pause was, there is a different essential business list for New York on pause. Schools, that would all close. It would no longer be a red zone. It would be even more severe than a red zone. So we will be looking out for that. By next week, I'm sure my entire presentation will be, what does it mean? The other thing to note here too is that there haven't been changes in the cluster designations yet this week, not since last week. That is, I'm sure that'll change when the metrics change. And I have some numbers that I will go over towards the end of this, but I also have some more immediate numbers that are coming right up. Hospitals. The biggest thing that came out of yesterday is the impetus on hospitals. Hospitals have a lot of things that they're going to be having to do to deal with this second surge of COVID. One of the biggest things on here is that Erie County has to suspend elective surgeries on Friday. Erie County's hospital capacity is going up, and they are looking to avoid the overflow. One other thing on here that's important to look at is they are trying to implement surge and flex operations. So if a hospital I'm in Albany, for example, if Albany Med is full, trying to get people to go into St. Peter's Hospital or, vice versa. That is going to be, something to be looking out for. And again, we don't necessarily have all of the data at this point, but this is what hospitals will have to do. And going forward, there is guidance that the Department of Health has put out on this. Taking a look at some of the data that's been coming out has been a little alarming. So this is data from yesterday. And today it's even worse, but this is the hospitalization data, and this is the type of thing that we're going to be looking at in the next week for what does it mean for the cluster zones. These numbers are going to become very important. I don't know yet what the threshold will be, but that's what they are currently. As you can see, Western New York and the Finger Lakes regions both have the highest hospitalization per 100,000 people. The share of hospital beds is, pretty, throughout the state. The most available is in the North Country, which should not be surprising. They have the lowest infection rate. So that's the type of data that we're going to be looking at when deciding what regions will be going into a new cluster zone. What does that mean ultimately for us? Caution. I'm not somebody who usually puts pictures in my slides, but today I felt like I needed to put a picture in my slide. We are really reaching a caution zone. I wrote down some stats from the governor's press call that he did at 11 today, and it's quite alarming, really, the increase that's occurring. We're looking at a 4.96% positivity rate from yesterday throughout the state. We are, the number of people hospitalized has reached 3,774. That is the same number of people that were hospitalized when Elmhurst Hospital failed in the spring. That's, obviously significant, but one thing to note is that the rate of transmission is significantly lower now than it was in March. Now, the rate of transmission over a 7-day average is it's about for going into the hospital. So it's 131 people per day are going into the hospital. So we're adding about 131 people into New York's hospital system. At the peak, so the end of March, beginning of April, we were seeing over 1,220 people per day entering the hospital system. So obviously very different than where we were in March. But there are, alarm bells are ringing, and they're ringing for real this time. Those things are changing. We are watching it. The Western New York still has the highest positivity rate out of any region in the state. It is steady. So we don't know what that will mean with the new hospitalization metrics that will be coming out, whether or not Buffalo would be going into a red zone. We have no idea at this point, which is not very helpful for clarity, but obviously we will be keeping in touch with it and keeping on top of it as much as we can. So with that, I kick it off to the next. Oh, I'm sorry, I fully forgot about it. My other slide. The Supreme Court issued a decision on Wednesday night. This decision, it's about religious gatherings in New York specifically, and about the cluster zone guidance. To be brief, the state is really not going to adhere to it. They are still going to say that that it only applied to the two plaintiffs in that case, and it doesn't apply statewide. And they are still going to say that the limits on the number of people that can be at a religious gathering in a cluster zone still exist. If you have other questions about that, if that implicates you at all, give us a call. We'd be happy to talk about it. And with that, I bid you adieu.
Okay, Katie, two quick follow-ups. First of all, on that particular case, I think it's important to note that, people will oftentimes distinguish the case on the facts or on the procedure that preceded it, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a lot about that case that could be argued means that it doesn't apply to other situations. And there's also, I think, a number of things in there that the state could do to try to correct potential criticisms. I mean, one of the observations in that case is that if you can't impose restrictions that are greater on religious entities than you could on other entities. So something to keep our eye on there. But your observation is that so far there's not an indication in Albany that they're backing off at all.
No, the governor even today said that they are not really backing off of it at all, that their view of it is that it only applies to them, to the two plaintiffs. So we'll see where it goes.
Okay. The other is I'm reminded back, kind of at the beginning of all this, the governor had the image. I could still see his hand turning in front of the screen, and we were going to open the pipeline. We may have to shut the pipeline down. The valve, yes. And I guess if we take that image forward, we now have many valves. We've got each region, okay, which is kind of a cluster with their valves, but we've also got a lot more inputs to whether or not those valves are opened or closed. Originally, it just seemed to be positive cases and hospitalizations, and it was a blunt instrument: shut the valve for the whole state or open the valve. And then we got regional approach. And now we've got the cluster approach, but it's really those inputs that I think keep evolving. The metrics are changing, the ones that are going to be considered, and frankly how they're being applied. So I guess that's more of an observation, but I'm just, as people are trying to keep track of where we're headed and what the future may look like, I guess we have to keep saying we're watching the current metrics, but those metrics are evolving pretty much on a daily or weekly basis.
Yeah, and that is what that's what the governor was expressing yesterday. With why we are changing this winter plan, it's because the data has changed, the metrics have changed. The real focus at this point has become hospitalization rates. Everybody thought schools was going to be it was going to be a lot worse than it was, and it's really not. And so that's a big shift. That's a big shift from a few months ago. So we're going to be, we're going to keep having a lot of big shifts, I think, in the next upcoming weeks.
Okay, well, thank you. And thanks for keeping your eye on it. Okay, we've got 3 presentations here on, sort of recurrent issues. If Katie's trying to tell us where we are, sort of in the present, and where we might be going in the future, now we want to talk about, how we deal with this as we go. The first up is Andrew Boberek. Andy's a member in our Syracuse office, and there are a lot of recurrent questions about return to work after exposure or positive tests. So, Andy, can you take us through the latest on that?
Sure, Pete. Will do. Good to be with everybody here today. There's obviously a lot going on here. We're seeing, again, across New York, higher incidence of testing, positive testing, contact tracing, and close and proximate contact with positive cases. And with that inevitably has led to what we've seen is a significant increase of calls from our clients looking for guidance. And, what do I do, right? My employee reports that somebody they live with tested positive. What do I do? And in many of these circumstances, we have pretty detailed guidance that the state has put out to walk you through these steps. I'll go through this in summary fashion and try to cover what I think are some general scenarios that are the most generally applicable. But I think it's important to note that a few things. One, the steps you will need to follow could very well depend on the type of nature of your industry, or your business, of your organization. So there's specific guidance for schools, there's specific guidance for nursing homes, there's specific guidance for healthcare facilities. So you need to refer to those. Second, this too is an evolving area. While the guidance has remained certainly more static than what we've seen with the cluster zones of late, there have been changes to this guidance, and you want to make sure that you have the most up-to-date copy. And that's not always an easy feat either, because even this morning, just trying to find these documents online, it's not always the easiest thing. And the document that you might get from what you think is a Google search that should be accurate doesn't necessarily give you that accurate document. So to the best of our knowledge, we've provided that updated information here. The URLs will link you to the relevant guidance, and then keep it handy. I deal with this on an everyday basis, and I still keep these documents right on top of my desk so that I can refer to them, and it can be helpful just to have those. And don't be ashamed that you need to keep them handy, because there's a lot going on right now. So let's kind of start generally and then work our way into the specific. There's guidance that New York put out through the Department of Health back in May 31st, and it's called their interim guidance for public and private employers. Again, our read is that this was intended to be generally applicable, absent an exception for, let's say, a healthcare institution or a skilled nursing facility, nursing home. And it walks you through the different steps and scenarios that you need to follow. And in this way, there's really 4, I think, steps that you need to think about, or 4 scenarios that you need to think about. The first is where you have an employee who tests positive. And in that situation, regardless of whether or not the person is symptomatic or asymptomatic, they can only return to work after 10 days of isolation, measured from the point at which the employee became symptomatic, if they're symptomatic, or from their first positive test, if they remain asymptomatic. So again, 10 days from either of those dates, whichever is applicable. Some confusion, because there was a lot of guidance out there before about 14 days, and that can still apply in certain situations. But again, here, the state has said it's 10. Now, if you have an employee who has close or proximate contact with someone who is infected, and that person themselves is symptomatic, well, then it's pretty simple. The symptomatic employee who's been exposed close and proximately to another individual can only return to work after 10 days of isolation from the onset of their symptoms, because again, in this situation, they're symptomatic. A quick aside, this close or proximate contact, you'll hear that frequently. For New York's purposes anyway, what they've said is that if you're within 6 feet of the infected individual for 10 minutes or more during a 48-hour window. That's the thumbnail sketch of it. That's considered close or proximate contact. And there's differing guidance that's out there on this point. What is close contact? The CDC has moved its position on this in the past, but for purposes of the New York's guidance and the return to work here under this May 31st guidance, that's what you need to know. If you have, again, an employee who has close or proximate contact with an infected individual and they are not symptomatic, well, then a different set of procedures follow. First, that if they're, again, had close or proximate contact and they're not symptomatic, they cannot return to work until after a 14-day self-quarantine period, unless, and this can be a helpful unless you deem that person's position to be essential and critical to the operations or safety of your workplace. And if you do, then that person can return sooner, so long as they remain asymptomatic. Now, there's a process that you need to follow. First, the employee supervisor and human resources need to make a documented determination that indeed it's essential to bring this person back. It'll be necessary for you to also work with local or the appropriate state officials regarding returning this individual to work. And then finally, there's certain steps that you'll need to take. If you jump over those hurdles, there's certain steps that you're going to need to take in order to have that employee be at work, such as mask wearing, isolation, cleaning, etc. And as long as you can meet all those requirements, you can bring that asymptomatic employee back, even though they've had close or proximate contact with a positive test. Finally, the fourth category is if you have somebody who reports as symptomatic to work, right? They fill out their form and they check the box saying, yes, I have a fever, or you scan them and they have a fever, or they come in and say, I don't feel well, I'm coughing, I feel like I have a fever. Well, if that happens, of course, you need to immediately send that person home. If they're becoming COVID symptomatic, I would encourage you to have them seek medical attention. And in that situation, the employee can't return to work until either 10 days have passed from the onset of those symptoms or upon receipt of a negative test. In either of those situations, that's the time frame when the employee can come back. And again, all this is really spelled out in the state's guidance. Now, there's a little bit of confusion because there was prior state guidance back before the valve was loosened and all of us could return to work in March of 31. So there's some confusion about, well, does the March 31 guidance apply, which is really focused on essential workers, or is it the May 31st guidance that applies? Our best read is that it's the May 31st guidance that applies, and that the intention was that this May 31st guidance would supersede the March guidance, which again was when that valve was much closer shut and really focused on just the essential employees. Now, we will tell you, based on our experiences, there are some municipalities in the departments of health, the local departments of health within those municipalities that are following the earlier guidance. In most cases, when you have a positive test or you have contact tracing, you're going to be dealing with those local health institutions. And so you'll know which guidance they need to follow. But if you have a question on that, certainly contact your bond attorney. Again, it's an issue that you can raise with local health officials to make sure you're following the right protocol there. And also, I just included a general link to the CDC's guidance. Again, it's more general, higher level, but it's something you'll want to consider. Now, on the next slide, we'll drill down into some of the specifics, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on these, but I did want to make them available to you so you have them. Again, the link should direct you to each one of them. The state has published specific guidance for a healthcare setting, and with the exception of nursing homes. There's separate guidance for nursing homes, but hopefully if you're operating a healthcare institution, you have this guidance already, keep it handy. It spells out what you need to do. I think it, in some instances, provides a little more flexibility for how you bring back a healthcare provider who has been exposed but who is asymptomatic. Conversely, if you have somebody who's positive, there can be more onerous restrictions on your ability to bring that person back. I would just note this guidance also talks about travel and specifically addresses travel by a healthcare provider to either one of the CDC designated zones or to one of the high incidence zones that the state has designated previously too. So you want to keep that in mind, that those restrictions could apply. And then finally, if you have a healthcare provider at your facility whose skills are truly unique and absolutely vital to operations and delivery of healthcare, the state says, contact us. We'll talk with you about how we can possibly get that person to return to work, even if they are positive. So that's there too. As I mentioned, there's guidance for nursing homes. Not surprisingly, based on what's transpired, we see a pretty strict guidelines here on the return to work. Again, if you're test positive or you're exposed to someone who's positive, it's a 14-day self-isolation that's required before somebody can return to work. And I would say additionally, there can be additional time on that if the person is still symptomatic, still has a fever, for example, that window could lengthen too before you could bring someone back to work. And finally, there's a very nice flow chart that the state published for school districts to use with respect to certainly students, but also several slides talking about how the process will work for teachers and staff at school districts and the process that you need to follow, which again is similar to what we see elsewhere and what we've discussed, but you certainly want to talk about that specifically. So Pete, that's the return to work guidance.
Andy, thanks. A lot of folks had requested those links. We can send those through the Q&A or through the chat box, so everyone has the links. You'll also be able to get them from the slides themselves once they're posted. Okay, turning now to Adam Masterleo. Adam's going to talk about the travel guidance. This is something that's changed a couple of times. Hasn't changed too much lately, but we're still getting an awful lot of questions, so we thought we'd answer them today. Adam, take it away.
Pete, thank you so much, and thank you again for having me. Like Andy did, I think the best way to approach the travel issues is to walk through various scenarios, the most common scenarios, and I think as with the return to work guidance, we will cover the scenarios that will hit hopefully 90 to 95% of what you will be encountering. There will always be that 5% or less, hopefully, where you have a unique situation. And I would encourage you in those circumstances to reach out to the attorney that you work with to get guidance, because there are a lot of pitfalls in these guidance documents, and you'll want to work with someone who understands how they were written and how to interpret them. So with all that said, let's start with the scenario-based approach to the travel guidance. So first of all, I think we can talk about travel to contiguous states as the first category. You travel to a contiguous state, your employee travels to a contiguous state. Contiguous states are Massachusetts, Vermont, Connecticut, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. If you or one of your employees travels to one of those states, you are not required to quarantine. You are not required to have any testing completed, and you are not required to complete the travel or health form. So I think that's the easiest scenario to start with. All right, second scenario, you or an employee travel to a non-contiguous state or a level 2 or 3 country that's been identified by the CDC. I think in that scenario, you have to first start with the question of how long has the individual, will just say, how long has your employee traveled out of state? If they were out of state for less than 24 hours, no quarantine is required, no testing is required, but the individual has to complete the traveler health form upon return to New York State. So that's second scenario. Third scenario, you travel to a non-contiguous state or a international level 2 or level 3 country, but you are out of New York State for greater than 24 hours. We start with the baseline rule that a 14-day quarantine is required for anyone who travels under those circumstances. Now, the most recent travel guidance gives individuals the ability to test out of that 14-day quarantine requirement. So there are 3 things that you have to do. 1, you have to get tested within 72 hours of when you return to New York State. And I'll pause on that for a second. we had a lot of clients asking us, well, does that mean that the test has to be done 72 hours before the return to New York State? What about somebody who only leaves the state for 48 hours? Our best interpretation of the guidance is that the test has to be completed within 72 hours of when you return to New York State, and therefore it could be completed on the same day that you are returning to New York State. It's not strict 3 days before you return, you have to get tested. It's within 72 hours. All right, so that's 1. 2, you've got to quarantine for 3 days when you return to New York. 3, you've got to get a second test on day 4 when you're back in New York. Upon receipt of that second negative test, you can come out of quarantine and avoid the full 14-day quarantine, which is the baseline. So a couple of other notes on those 3 requirements. 1, strict compliance is going to be required for you to get out of the full 14-day quarantine. If you don't get the test within 72 hours of returning to New York, you don't get out of the 14-day quarantine. If you don't quarantine for 3 days when you come back, you don't get out of the quarantine. If you don't get the test on day 4, you don't get out of the quarantine. So it's important to note that in order to test out, strict compliance is going to be required. The other thing to note is that the guidance does not specify what kind of test is approved. So our interpretation of that has been that either a PCR test or a rapid test, both of which have been approved by the FDA, would suffice and could be used to test out of the quarantine requirement. All right, now a couple of other notes on the travel quarantine requirements. Number 1, everyone traveling from a non-contiguous state or a level 2 or level 3 country has to complete the traveler health form. So this form is found online. It's also being handed out by certain airlines if you're flying. But in either case, if you're traveling for if you are traveling, no matter how long your travel is out of New York State, if you're traveling to a non-contiguous state or a level 2 or level 3 country, you have to complete the traveler health form. Now, there is an exception. There are a couple of exceptions I wanted to mention as well. The biggest one is the exception for essential workers. And the most recent travel guidance changed the essential worker exception a little bit, but I think it's important to go over what essential workers have to do now under the current travel guidance. So 1, when they return, they have to get a test on day 4. So the old guidance required more. It required a test within 24 hours and certain quarantining outside of work. The new guidance requires a test on day 4 when the essential worker returns to New York. There was some question early on about whether or not essential employees had to quarantine for those first 3 days after they got back, between the time when they returned to New York and when they got the test on day 4. Our best interpretation is that essential workers do not need to quarantine during those 3 days, so long as they get the test on day 4. And obviously the test comes back negative. Essential workers still have to fill out the traveler health form. It doesn't matter if you are an essential worker. Like I said just a moment ago, any traveler to a non-contiguous state for any amount of time has to complete that traveler health form. Another question that we were getting from employers is, well, does the type of travel matter? If I'm an essential employee, if I'm traveling for personal versus business reasons, do I not get the benefit of the essential employee exception? And the answer is the type of travel does not matter. If you're an essential employee, you get the benefit of the essential employee exception to the travel quarantine requirement. One other thing that I wanted to hit on before I wrapped up was international travel. So there was some confusion early on about whether or not the New York guidance applied to international travel. The state then put out guidance in October that said that international travelers had to quarantine no matter what. They didn't get the benefit of any of the exceptions. The most recent travel guidance, and the travel guidance that controls now, makes it clear that international travelers to level 2 or level 3 countries can test out just like anybody else. So they are no longer subject to this strict 14-day quarantine requirement. They have the ability to test out so long as they follow the test out requirements. In addition, International travelers can also benefit from the essential employee exception. So that's new in this November 3rd guidance. Important things to consider for international travelers as well. So Pete, with that, I will wrap up the travel quarantine discussion, and unless you have any questions, and move on to the next section.
Well, no, I think you've covered it. Again, there are a lot of specific questions that people may have. Feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to walk you through it. But I think, Adam, you really gave us a strong framework for that. So appreciate that. Okay, we're going to move on now to Kate McClung. Kate's in our Rochester office. And I guess we've been talking a little bit about, can they work? Can they work after travel? Can they work after exposure? Now we're going to focus on the question of what happens if they can't work, and the leave issues and the evolving landscape there.
Thanks, Pete. So there have been quite a few new laws passed in 2020 with respect to leaves, and they weren't drafted to necessarily fit well together. And so it's still causing a lot of questions for employers. What type of leave applies in this situation versus this other situation? And that can be a pretty complicated issue. These laws have different qualifying reasons for the leave. They have different exceptions. The length of the leave is different. The amount of pay is different. Some you get tax credits for, some you don't. Some of these statutes have expiration dates and some don't. So I thought it would be helpful just to go down the list and sort of provide a checklist of the types of leave you should be considering and what some of the key differences are between those leaves. So first up on the list, Families First Coronavirus Response Act, the FFCRA, and this provides for two types of leave: the Emergency Paid Sick Leave, or EPSL, and the Emergency Family and Medical Leave, or EFMLA. This is set to expire December 31st of this year. So this may be something that you don't have to think about much longer if it doesn't get renewed or extended. The EPSL is just 80 hours of leave over 2 weeks, and there's 6 reasons an employee can get that. If they're subject to a governmental order of quarantine, or their healthcare provider advises them to quarantine, if they're caring for an individual, not just a family member, but an individual who's subject to a government order or advice from a healthcare provider to quarantine, if the employee themselves is symptomatic and seeking diagnosis. There was a question in the Q&A, what if the person's just symptomatic but says they're not going to seek diagnosis? And that wouldn't be covered. This qualifying reason does require that they're going to seek diagnosis as well. If their childcare or school is closed due to COVID-19, and that does include where the school is under a hybrid arrangement where the employee is only allowed to send their child on certain days, while the other days the school is considered closed to them, and that would be a qualifying reason. Or if they're experiencing a substantially similar condition as defined by HHS. So that's EPSL. So there's 6 reasons there, and it's just the 80 hours, but EFMLA leave is 12 weeks. The first 2 are unpaid. The rest is paid, subject to certain limitations and certain caps. But that you can only take for the childcare reason, where the childcare or school is closed due to COVID-19. There are a number of exceptions to this law. It doesn't apply to large employers with 500 plus employees. Certain parts of it don't apply to certain public sector employers. There's an optional exception for healthcare workers, which, remember, that term for the exception was narrowed by regulation by the U.S. Department of Labor in September. So it's not as broad as an exception as it initially was, as well as the emergency responder exception. There's also an optional exception for employers with 50 or less employees, but there are some pretty narrow requirements to fit into that exception there. So I don't recommend relying on that without seeking legal advice. For EPSL, it is just the one bank of 80 hours. They can't take it 80 hours for each qualifying reason. Same with the EFMLA, and it's important to remember that 12-week bank for EFMLA is the same 12-week bank as for FMLA leave. So if you had an employee who took 6 weeks of FMLA for a back surgery last month, then they've already used 6 weeks. They can only take 6 weeks of EFMLA leave now, assuming you're in the same 12-month period. Now, some people define their calendar years for FMLA purposes to mean their fiscal year, for example. So you may be in 2 separate FMLA years in 2020. And so one question I get is, okay, well, you know, they did use some FMLA, but that was in April, which was in the last calendar year. Does that mean they have 12 full weeks now? And so another quirk to keep in mind is while it comes out of the same 12-week bank as traditional FMLA, there's also a rule that they can't take more than 12 weeks of EFMLA total. So if they took 6 weeks of EFMLA in the spring, even if you're in a new 12-month year for FMLA purposes, they still only can take the remainder of the 12 weeks of EFMLA. They can't take more than 12 weeks total of that. There's also some recent guidance from the U.S. Department of Labor that if for hybrid school arrangements, they don't consider that intermittent leave if the employee asks to take leave on all the days the school is closed to them, even though it's not continuous leave. Typically, under the regulations with intermittent EFMLA or EPSL leave, employees can only take it intermittently with the employer's consent, but the U.S. Department of Labor is interpreting hybrid arrangements not as intermittent leave, where the employee is taking all the days off that the school is closed. This type of leave does have the tax credit. The other types of leave don't, but the fact that there is the tax credit for this leave means it's really important that you calculate the amount that you're paying the employee correctly, both in terms of how many hours they're getting per week and in terms of how much you're paying them per week. In terms of the hours, it's important to remember you have to base it on their normal schedule, and there's certain rules you have to follow if there is no normal schedule. And so that includes overtime hours. So if someone typically works 50 hours a week, you're basing this off of that 50 hours a week. But and for the amount that you're paying them, you have to base it off their regular rate. So you don't have to pay them overtime premiums if you're paying them 50 hours a week, but you do have to pay them their full regular rate. And that can include things beyond a straight hourly rate. It may include non-discretionary bonuses or commissions or shift differentials or hazard pay, or there's all sorts of other things that can go into the regular rate. So it's important to make sure you're computing this correctly, because if you're overpaying the employee, then the IRS is going to take an issue that you're taking too big of a tax credit. If you're underpaying the employee, you can get into trouble with a DOL audit or with a lawsuit from the employee. So it's really important to get that calculation correct. We also have the New York COVID-19 leave law. This applies to public and private employers. It requires paid days off depending on how big the employer is. Certain small employers don't have to provide any paid days. And these are calendar days off, not working days. So it's either 0 paid days, 5 paid days, or 14 paid days. But as I said, that's calendar days. So someone who works 5 days a week, if they're at a large employer, they wouldn't get paid for 14 days. They would get paid for 10 days because that's how much they typically work in a 14 calendar day period. There is special guidance issued by the New York Department of Health on healthcare workers. So they've said that where the employer sends the healthcare worker home under certain circumstances, that can be a governmental order of quarantine and trigger leave under this law. But for non-healthcare workers, so for most of your employees, you really only have to look at whether or not they're under a governmental order of quarantine, because that's the qualifying reason for this leave. Also, healthcare workers in certain circumstances can be eligible for a second and third round of paid leave, according to the guidance by the New York Department of Health on this as well. So it's important. There's guidance dated both May 17th and June 25th. So it is important if you have healthcare workers in your employ to look at those documents, because the rules are a bit different for them. There's exceptions here as well. If you have an employee who's asymptomatic and can telecommute, can work from home, they're not entitled to leave. There's certain exceptions where someone's traveled to certain states or certain other countries and received notice that they may not be eligible for this leave. There's also, in addition to the paid leave by the employer, the employees can also be eligible for certain COVID-19 disability benefits and paid family leave as well. And there's different rules than traditional paid family leave and disability benefits here as well. There's no waiting period. They can use them concurrently. The disability is paid at a much higher rate. But this does seem to be just for employees at public sector companies with less than 100 employees. Also, this law provides that you can only take the difference in benefits between what you're entitled to under this law and what you're entitled to under any federal statute. So you always want to give them leave under the FFCRA first, and then they just get anything extra under this law, the difference between the two laws. They can't take all the FFCRA and then all the New York COVID-19 leave. And then finally, we have the New York paid sick leave, which isn't a COVID specific statute, but it certainly can apply in COVID situations. This, you had to start accruing the paid sick leave September 30th, and employees can start using it January 1st. And so this can be taken for illnesses and health conditions of the employee or family member, and family members defined pretty broadly. So certainly there's going to be COVID situations where this leave comes into play as well. Remember, you have to accrue 1 hour for every 30 hours worked. It carries over from year to year. And you can't ask for confidential information as a requirement for this leave. Finally, the last change of the year is New York unemployment as modified by the CARES Act. The CARES Act really expanded the eligibility requirements for New York unemployment to apply in certain COVID situations. So that's also something important to keep in mind as well, that employees may be eligible for that leave. Finally, in addition to all the new laws, if we can go to the next slide, it's also important to keep in mind that all the laws that we've had pre-COVID can still apply as well. Certainly FMLA leave can apply if the employee or the family member has serious enough COVID that it qualifies as a serious health condition under the ADA and the human rights law. If their COVID is serious enough to constitute a disability, they may be entitled to reasonable accommodations, including leave of absence. New York paid family leave may apply if the family member's COVID is serious enough to qualify as a serious health condition under that law. New York disability benefits may apply where the employee's COVID qualifies as a disability. And also workers' comp leave, you may see employees filing claims claiming that they caught COVID at work. And so that may be another thing that you encounter as well. So it's really a lot of different laws that you need to think through in each situation, which isn't always easy, but if you ever need help thinking through it or brainstorming, just let us know. I'll pass it back to you, Pete.
Thanks, Kate. And I guess just to, sort of keep our eye on it, the Families First Act is slated to expire at the end of the year, as you noted. And New York, paid leave comes into effect. And so we're, kind of like ships passing in the night a little bit, but I guess we'll have to also wait and see what we get out of Congress, either in the next couple months or after the Biden administration starts.
Yeah, I mean, there may be a gap too. It may expire December 31st, but then maybe mid-February, new administrations come in, new Congress, maybe they reinstate or pass something brand new.
Okay, great. Thank you. And thanks everyone for being with us again this week. We'll see you again next week. In the meantime, please stay safe and take care.